If you were a prince, heir to a 1,000-year fortune in a magnificent palace, what would you do when war broke out? Most would play it safe, staying behind to protect their legacy. But one prince made a different choice. He traded the magnificent palace for muddy trenches. He ditched his silken ceremonial robes for a pilot's uniform. His name was Heinrich Egon of the House of Fürstenberg, heir to one of Germany's greatest families. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose. So why did he do it? Why would a man born to sit on the throne choose to fly into the heart of the bloodiest war in history on a mission from which he knew he might never return? This is the forgotten story of the prince who chose honor over life, and what his tragic choice tells us about the end of an entire world. To truly grasp Heinrich Egon's place in history, we need to delve deeply into the socio-political and cultural landscape of Europe at the close of the 19th century, a period marked by profound transformations that shaped the continent's aristocracy and foreshadowed global upheaval. This era, spanning roughly from 1871 to 1914, is commonly referred to as the Belle Époque in France, or the Beautiful Era, characterized by a facade of stability, technological advancement, and cultural flourishing that masked underlying tensions. In France, it coincided with the Third Republic's consolidation after the Franco-Prussian War, fostering an environment where Paris became the epicenter of art, literature, and innovation, with figures like Gustave Eiffel constructing iconic structures such as the Eiffel Tower in 1889, symbolizing human ingenuity and progress. Across Europe, this time saw rapid industrialization, with the Second Industrial Revolution introducing electricity, telephones, and automobiles. Early models, like Carl Benz's 1886 motor wagon, clattering along urban streets, replacing horse-drawn carriages and altering daily life for the elite. Gaslights illuminated boulevards in cities like Vienna, Berlin, and London, enabling a vibrant nightlife of theaters, operas, and cafes where intellectuals debated ideas from Darwinism to socialism. Yet, this optimism was underpinned by economic disparities. While the bourgeoisie amassed wealth through colonial exploitation and trade, the working classes endured harsh conditions, leading to labor movements and strikes that hinted at future unrest. The European aristocracy during this period represented the pinnacle of inherited privilege, a class whose power derived from centuries-old lineages, intertwined through strategic marriages that often served diplomatic purposes. These families controlled vast estates, influenced politics, and maintained a lifestyle of extravagance, with annual social seasons featuring balls at venues like Vienna's Hofburg Palace or London's Buckingham Palace, where debutantes were presented and alliances forged. The aristocracy's wealth stemmed from land ownership, investments in emerging industries like railways and mining, and colonial holdings that provided raw materials and markets. In the German Empire, established in 1871 under Otto von Bismarck's unification, the nobility adapted to a constitutional monarchy where they deferred to Kaiser Wilhelm II after his ascension in 1888, but retained significant influence through institutions like the Prussian House of Lords. This body, composed of hereditary peers, acted as a conservative counterbalance to the Reichstag, preserving the traditional powers and privileges of the nobility against rising democratic pressures. The old guard's assumption of leadership was rooted in feudal traditions, viewing themselves as natural rulers by divine right or historical precedent, a mindset that clashed with emerging nationalism and republican sentiments in countries like France and Italy. Within this elite stratum, the House of Fürstenberg stood out as one of the most illustrious families of the Hochadel, the high nobility of the Holy Roman Empire's remnants, whose origins traced back to the 13th century in Swabia, southern Germany. Originally mediatized princes who ruled the Principality of Fürstenberg until its dissolution in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars, they retained mediatized status, granting them equality with reigning houses and seats in various legislative bodies. By the late 19th century, the family possessed extensive lands in Baden-Württemberg, Bohemia, and Austria, including forests, castles, and breweries that generated substantial revenue. Their principal residence was the Donaueschingen Palace, a Baroque masterpiece overlooking the Danube's source, where they hosted grand events and managed estates encompassing over 100,000 hectares. The Fürstenbergs were not mere relics. They evolved into modern capitalists investing in coal mines, hotels, and infrastructure, blending traditional land-based wealth with industrial ventures. Their social standing was impeccable, with marriages linking them to other noble houses like the Schönborn and Kevin-Hüller, reinforcing a network that spanned empires. Heinrich Egon's father, Prince Maximilian Egon II zu Fürstenberg, embodied this fusion of old-world nobility and contemporary influence, serving as a key figure in the German Empire's upper echelons. Born on October 13, 1863 in Lani, Bohemia, to Prince Maximilian Egon Kurs and Countess Leontina von Kevin-Hüller-Metsch. He inherited the princely title in 1896 upon the death of his cousin, Charles Egon IV. As a landowner, Maximilian Egon II oversaw vast ancestral properties, including Heiligenberg Castle on Lake Constance, and estates in Prussia, Austria, Hungary, Württemberg, and Baden, which afforded him multiple seats in regional houses of lords. His industrial pursuits extended to mining operations and breweries, diversifying the family's fortune amid Europe's economic boom. Politically, he was appointed to the Prussian House of Lords in 1897, rising to vice president by 1911, where he advocated for conservative policies that protected aristocratic interests against socialist encroachments. His military service included roles in both the German and Austro-Hungarian armies, attaining the rank of Major General and serving as an orderly officer, reflecting the dual citizenship and loyalties common among border nobility. Maximilian Egon II's proximity to power was most evident in his close friendship with Kaiser Wilhelm II, who ascended the throne in 1888 and pursued an aggressive Weltpolitik of naval expansion and colonial acquisition. The Kaiser, known for his impulsive diplomacy and militarism, frequently visited Donaueschingen for hunting parties and consultations, treating Maximilian as a trusted confidant. These gatherings involved discussions on foreign policy, such as the Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, which heightened tensions with France and Britain. For young Heinrich Egon, growing up in this environment meant exposure to imperial rituals, diplomatic intrigue, and the constant presence of high-ranking officials, giving him an early understanding of both his immense privilege and Europe's fragile balance of power. This world of privilege, however, concealed profound vulnerabilities that would culminate in catastrophe. The Belle Epoque's surface glamour obscured a continent rife with rivalries. The Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy faced off against the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain, forged through secret treaties and mutual suspicions. Military buildups were relentless. Germany's Schlieffen Plan envisioned a swift invasion of France, while Britain's dreadnought battleships escalated a naval arms race. Nationalism surged in the Balkans, where Slavic peoples chafed under Austro-Hungarian rule, fueling groups like the Black Hand that would assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. In Germany, Wilhelm II's bellicose rhetoric alienated allies, while domestic issues like the Zabern Affair of 1913 exposed authoritarian excesses. Colonial competitions in Africa and Asia, exemplified by the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, sowed seeds of conflict over resources. Economic interdependence through trade and finance created illusions of peace, but protectionist tariffs and labor unrest eroded stability. The aristocracy, including families like the Fürstenbergs, largely dismissed these threats, focused on preserving their status amid modernization. Yet, the old empires, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German, strained under ethnic diversity and autocratic rule, with reform efforts stifled by conservative elites. Born Erbprinz in Vienna, in March 1896, Heinrich stood where Fürstenberg tradition met a new century's risk. Duty now meant leading from the front. Maximilian Egon II's era saw the family thrive economically, with investments yielding profits that funded lavish lifestyles, private trains, art collections, and international travels. Childhood for heirs like Heinrich Egon involved tutors in languages, history, and etiquette, summers at estates like Heiligenberg, and introductions to court life. The Kaiser's visits brought pomp military parades, banquets with silver service, and conversations on realpolitik. However, this privilege blinded many to the powder keg of Europe, as Bismarck termed the Balkans. The 1890s saw crises like the Dreyfus Affair in France, exposing anti-Semitism and division, while Britain's Boer War, 1899 to 1902, revealed imperial overreach. By 1900, anarchists assassinated leaders like Umberto I of Italy, signaling ideological threats. The aristocracy's intermarriages meant to solidify alliances, instead entangled families in national conflicts. Fürstenberg relatives served in multiple armies during World War I. The Belle Epoque's belief in progress stemmed from scientific breakthroughs, Pasteur's vaccines, Curie's radioactivity, but ignored social inequities. Urbanization swelled cities, with Berlin's population doubling to 2 million by 1900, fostering slums alongside opulent districts. Aristocrats like Maximilian Egon II invested in these changes, but their conservatism opposed suffrage expansions and welfare reforms. Kaiser Wilhelm II's personal rule, after dismissing Bismarck in 1890, amplified instability with policies like the Navy Laws of 1898 provoking Britain. For the Fürstenbergs, close to the Kaiser, this meant navigating court factions, where Wilhelm's favoritism could elevate or ruin careers. Heinrich Egon's formative years absorbed this atmosphere of intrigue, where loyalty to the monarchy clashed with emerging pan-German nationalism. Beneath the gilded surface, Europe's great powers engaged in a perilous arms race and alliance system that rigidified diplomacy. The Franco-Russian alliance of 1894 countered Germany's isolation, while the Entente Cordiale, 1904, and Anglo-Russian Entente, 1907, encircled the Central Powers. Military spending soared. Germany's army grew to 800,000 by 1914, with compulsory service instilling martial values. Nationalism eroded multinational empires in Austria-Hungary. Czechs and Hungarians demanded autonomy, while Russia's Pan-Slavism supported Serbia against Vienna. The Moroccan incidents nearly sparked war, highlighting colonial rivalries. Few aristocrats foresaw the scale. Maximilian Egon II focused on his estates and politics, likely viewed tensions as manageable, given his pre-WWI role in the Prussian House of Lords advocating stability. This intricate world, beautiful in its cultural peaks, like the Art Nouveau movement or Wagner's operas at Bayreuth, yet fragile due to unresolved conflicts, defined Heinrich Egon's origins. The House of Fürstenberg's prestige, bolstered by Maximilian Egon II's industrial acumen and imperial ties, offered unparalleled advantages, but the era's undercurrents of militarism and nationalism heralded destruction. Heinrich Egon, born amid this splendor, inherited a legacy tested by cataclysm, underscoring how privilege coexisted with peril in late 19th century Europe. This legacy of immense privilege, now facing the test of a cataclysmic new century, was placed upon the shoulders of a single child from the moment he drew his first breath. Born in Vienna in March 1896, Heinrich Egon Fave, hereditary Prince zu Fürstenberg, entered a world where his fate was sealed by birthright and tradition, embodying the expectations placed on the scions of ancient noble houses in the waning years of the Austro-Hungarian and German empires. As the eldest son in a family whose lineage traced back to the 13th century, he was designated the Erbprinz from infancy, a title that signified not just inheritance, but the solemn responsibility to uphold and perpetuate the Fürstenberg dynasty's prestige, wealth, and influence across multiple territories. This role was ingrained in the family structure. The House of Fürstenberg, mediatized princes since the early 19th century, had long navigated the complexities of German unification under Prussian dominance, retaining vast estates and political clout despite the loss of sovereign rule. Heinrich Egon's position as heir apparent meant from birth he was prepared to carry the immense responsibilities in honor of a name that represented the pinnacle of southern German nobility, where every decision would reflect on centuries of accumulated honor and power. His birth in Vienna, the cultural and political heart of the Habsburg Empire, underscored the family's dual allegiances, tied to both the German Kaiser and the Austrian Emperor, allowing them to maneuver in the intricate web of European aristocracy. The event was likely marked by formal announcements in noble circles, with christening ceremonies attended by relatives from interconnected houses like the Schönborn or Kaivenhüller, reinforcing alliances through ritual and kinship. His early years unfolded amid a series of majestic residences that exemplified the opulent lifestyle of the Hochadel, each property serving as both a home and a symbol of the family's enduring status. The imposing Donaueschingen Palace, located in Baden-Württemberg near the Danube source, was the principal seat, a sprawling Baroque complex built in the 18th century, encompassing grand halls adorned with frescoes, extensive libraries, and galleries filled with art collected over generations. Here, young Heinrich Egon would have spent summers exploring the palace's 100,000 hectares of forests, learning the rhythms of estate management from stewards who oversaw hunting grounds, breweries, and agricultural operations that generated substantial income. The romantic Heiligenberg Castle, perched on a hill overlooking Lake Constance, offered a more idyllic retreat. This Renaissance-era fortress, acquired by the family in the 19th century, featured terraced gardens, medieval towers, and panoramic views that inspired a sense of historical continuity. Family lore and daily life there would immerse him in tales of ancestors who had served as imperial counselors or military leaders, fostering an early appreciation for legacy. Complementing these rural estates was their elegant Viennese home, possibly a palais in the Innere district, furnished with empire-style antiques, crystal chandeliers, and salons where high society gathered for soirees. This urban residence facilitated exposure to Vienna's vibrant cultural scene. Operas at the Hofburg, concerts featuring Strauss waltzes, and intellectual discussions amid the city's coffee houses, blending provincial nobility with cosmopolitan sophistication. Moving between these homes via private trains or carriages, Heinrich Egon's childhood was a constant whirlwind, instilling adaptability and a profound connection to the land and traditions that defined his class. His education was rigorous and multifaceted, designed to equip him not merely with knowledge, but with the tools to govern vast holdings and navigate the political landscapes of pre-war Europe. From an early age, private tutors, often scholars from prestigious universities like Heidelberg or Vienna, delivered a curriculum tailored to aristocratic heirs, emphasizing classical languages such as Latin, Greek, French, and English to enable diplomatic correspondence and international relations. History lessons delved into the Fürstenberg family's past, from their elevation to princely status in 1664 to their role in the Holy Roman Empire's dissolution, teaching him the importance of alliances and resilience amid shifting powers. Legal studies focused on feudal law, property rights, and constitutional matters relevant to the German Empire's federal structure, where noble families like his retained seats in regional houses of lords. A significant portion was devoted to the intricacies of managing vast estates, accounting for revenues from coal mines in Bohemia, forestry operations in Swabia, and investments in emerging industries like railways, which his father had pioneered to modernize the family's fortune. This practical training included site visits to family properties, where he observed tenant relations, crop rotations, and financial audits, ensuring he understood the economic foundations of noble power. Beyond academics, etiquette and protocol were paramount, with instruction in courtly manners, heraldry, and genealogy to prepare him for interactions with royalty, such as the Kaiser's frequent visits to Donaueschingen. The goal of this education was simple: to create a leader who could command respect through his character and knowledge, not just by force, and who understood his duty to protect the family's traditions in a rapidly changing world. Physical prowess was equally emphasized in his upbringing, reflecting the aristocratic ideal that a nobleman must embody strength and discipline to command respect in both social and military spheres. Heinrich Egon developed into an exceptional horseman, mastering equestrian skills through rigorous training on the family's estates. This included dressage, jumping, and long-distance rides across the Black Forest terrains surrounding Donaueschingen, skills honed under expert instructors who emphasized control and endurance. Fencing lessons, often conducted with épées or sabers in palace salle d'armes, taught precision, agility, and strategic thinking, drawing from the dueling traditions that still lingered in noble circles despite legal prohibitions. Shooting proficiency was cultivated during hunting expeditions, where he learned to handle rifles and shotguns amid the deer forests of Heiligenberg, participating in organized hunts that doubled as social events attended by peers and imperial guests. These activities were not mere recreations, but hallmarks of a nobleman, symbolizing readiness for leadership and defense of honor. They built physical resilience, fostering traits like courage and composure under pressure, essential for a class that viewed itself as the natural elite in an era of emerging mass societies. But beyond these practical skills, Heinrich Egon was steeped in the unwritten code of the German aristocracy, a moral framework centered on Pflicht, duty, and Ehre, honor, which permeated every aspect of his formation. Pflicht demanded unwavering commitment to familial obligations, such as preserving estates for future generations, through prudent management and strategic marriages, often arranged to consolidate alliances with other noble houses. Era, meanwhile, encompassed personal integrity, loyalty to the monarchy, and upholding social hierarchies, where any scandal could tarnish the entire lineage. A prince's life was fundamentally one of service to his family by ensuring dynastic continuity, to his lineage by honoring ancestral achievements, and to his emperor by supporting the imperial order against republican or socialist threats. Personal desires for love, art, or simple leisure always came second. They were seen as distractions from his primary duty to his family and his emperor. This code was reinforced through family rituals, such as attending Mass in private chapels or participating in charitable endeavors that demonstrated noblesse oblige, the obligation of the privileged to aid the less fortunate. For a young man of his standing at the dawn of the 20th century, the ultimate embodiment of duty and honor lay in military service, an arena where abstract virtues translated into tangible action. An officer's commission in a prestigious regiment, such as the Prussian Guards or an Austro-Hungarian cavalry unit, was not a voluntary career but an intrinsic expectation, serving as a rite of passage that validated his social hierarchy placement. Nobles dominated officer corps, with commissions often secured through family connections. For Heinrich Egon, this might involve training at elite academies like the Theresian Military Academy in Wiener Neustadt or the Prussian Kriegsakademie, focusing on tactics, leadership, and discipline. Service affirmed loyalty to the Kaiser, who as supreme warlord embodied the state's militaristic ethos and prepared heirs for potential conflicts in an age of arms races. Heinrich Egon embodied this ideal through his brightness, evident in academic excellence and athleticism, positioning him as destined for a life of tradition and leadership. He was envisioned to complete advanced studies in law or economics at universities like Bonn or Munich, serve with distinction in uniform, perhaps rising to captaincy in peacetime maneuvers, and select a suitable bride from houses like the Windisch Grätz or Nostitz Rieneck, ensuring alliances and heirs. Upon inheritance, he would assume his father's immense responsibilities overseeing estates spanning Prussia, Austria, and Baden, sitting in legislative bodies, and maintaining ties to the court, all to perpetuate a 1,000-year-old dynasty in what appeared a stable world of imperial pomp and economic prosperity. Then the summer of 1914 arrived, abruptly shattering this illusion of stability with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28th, an act by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip that ignited long-simmering tensions in the Balkans. This event, occurring amid Austria-Hungary's annexation crises and Slavic unrest, triggered the intricate web of European alliances, Austria's ultimatum to Serbia, Russia's mobilization in support of its Slavic kin, Germany's blank check to Vienna, and the ensuing declarations of war that engulfed the continent. Within weeks, by August 1st, when Germany declared war on Russia, followed by invasions of Belgium and France, the continent plunged into the abyss of the First World War, mobilizing millions in a conflict expected to be short but proving devastating. The glittering Belle Epoque, with its illusions of perpetual progress and peace, became an instant memory, replaced by trench warfare, poison gas, and mechanized slaughter. For Prince Heinrich Egon, now in his late teens, the abstract concepts of duty and honor became terrifyingly real. Military service shifted from ceremonial parades to frontline combat, where nobles like him led charges in battles like the Marne or Tannenberg, facing unprecedented casualties. The world he knew, of secure estates, courtly rituals, and dynastic certainties, was about to be irrevocably transformed. As the war eroded empires, redrew maps, and challenged the very foundations of aristocracy, forcing survivors like him to adapt to a post-1918 landscape of republics and revolutions. The outbreak of war in August 1914 unleashed a torrent of patriotic fervor across Germany, manifesting in widespread enthusiasm that swept through urban centers and rural areas alike, fueled by years of militaristic education, nationalist propaganda, and the belief in a quick defensive war against encircling enemies. The streets of Berlin echoed with cheers as young men marched off to what they believed would be a swift and glorious victory, with crowds gathering at landmarks like the Brandenburg Gate to wave flags and sing Deutschland über alles, while newspapers such as the Berliner Tageblatt reported on the mobilization with headlines emphasizing unity and resolve. This initial wave of war euphoria was widespread, as historian Geoffrey Verhey has documented in studies of German public opinion, where even socialists who had opposed war in the Reichstag rallied under the Burg-Frieden Truce, suspending political divisions for the national cause. The Kaiser's declaration of, "I no longer recognize parties or confessions. Today we are all German brothers," captured the mood, leading to over 1.3 million volunteers in the first months, supplementing the 4 million conscripts under the Schlieffen Plan's rapid advance through Belgium. For the aristocracy, it was a chance to prove their mettle, to live up to the heroic tales of their ancestors, from conflicts like the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, where noble officers had led charges that forged the empire. Families like the Fürstenbergs, with their long history of military service in Prussian and Austrian armies, saw the war as an opportunity to reaffirm their role as the nation's elite warriors, with many heirs enlisting immediately to embody the ideals of loyalty and sacrifice ingrained in their upbringing. Prince Heinrich Egon, imbued with this very spirit, immediately volunteered, driven by the familial tradition of service and the cultural expectation that noble sons would lead from the front, contributing to the high proportion of aristocratic officers in the German army, where they made up about 30% of the officer corps, despite being less than 0.1% of the population. He joined the elite Guard Cuirassier Regiment, a prestigious heavy cavalry unit steeped in Prussian military tradition, tracing its roots to Frederick the Great's era and known for its gleaming cuirasses, plumed helmets, and role as the Kaiser's personal bodyguard in parades. This regiment, part of the Guards Corps, was stationed near Potsdam and recruited from the nobility, emphasizing equestrian skills and discipline, with training that included saber drills and formation charges designed for breakthrough tactics. With his exceptional horsemanship honed through years of riding on family estates, he would have initially seemed perfectly suited to this role, capable of executing the precise maneuvers that had won battles in earlier wars, such as the cavalry's decisive actions at Mars-la-Tour in 1870. However, the romantic vision of cavalry charges soon collided with the grim realities of modern warfare, as the advent of rapid-fire weapons and fortified positions made traditional tactics suicidal, leading to catastrophic losses in the early months of the conflict. The machine gun, exemplified by the Maxim gun capable of firing 600 rounds per minute, and the entrenched lines established after the Battle of the Marne in September 1914, rendered the mounted soldier tragically obsolete, with German cavalry units suffering up to 80% casualties in attempts to exploit breaches in French lines during the race to the sea. Historical accounts from soldiers like Ernst Jünger in Storm of Steel describe how cavalry, once the shock troops of armies, were mowed down in open fields, their horses entangled in barbed wire under artillery barrages that churned the ground into mud. The war quickly devolved into a brutal stalemate of trench warfare, a landscape of mud, barbed wire, and relentless artillery fire that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea, encompassing over 700 kilometers of fortifications by late 1914. This system of opposing trenches, separated by no man's land riddled with craters and corpses, involved soldiers living in squalor, exposed to constant shelling from weapons like the German 15-centimeter howitzer, which could fire 5 shells per minute over 8 kilometers, causing psychological trauma known as shell shock. For a young man of Heinrich Egon's spirit and courage, the stagnant horror of the trenches must have been a stark disappointment compared to the heroic combat he had envisioned, where instead of gallant charges, days were spent in rat-infested ditches, enduring gas attacks, first used at Ypres in 1915, and futile infantry assaults that resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, at battles like Verdun in 1916, a 10-month battle of attrition that caused over 700,000 casualties for just a few square kilometers of land. Driven by a desire for more dynamic action, he looked to the skies, hoping to find a form of combat where a single soldier's skill and courage could still make a difference, as aviation emerged as a domain where skill and daring could still decide outcomes. The airplane was the cutting-edge weapon of this new kind of war, evolving from reconnaissance roles in 1914 to armed fighters by 1915, with innovations like the interrupter gear, allowing machine guns to fire through propellers, pioneered by Anthony Fokker for the Germans. The daring pilots who engaged in dogfights high above the trenches were hailed as heroes back home, the new celebrities of a modern war, with figures like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, achieving celebrity status for their dogfights, where maneuvers like the Immelmann turn enabled pilots to reverse direction mid-air to gain advantage. This form of combat attracted adventurous spirits from the cavalry, as it offered mobility and personal confrontation in contrast to the anonymous death in the trenches, with pilots often flying in loose formations to hunt enemy aircraft. It was a dangerous, glamorous, and intensely personal form of combat that drew the most adventurous young men from all sides of the conflict, with German air service recruitment prioritizing officers from elite units, leading to over 7,000 pilots trained by war's end, though with high attrition rates. For a cavalry officer now facing a war without horses, the German Army Air Service, the Luftstreitkräfte, presented a compelling new arena for his skills and his sense of duty. Established in 1916, under the command of Ernst von Hübner, to consolidate aerial operations, incorporating units like the Feldflieger Abteilungen for reconnaissance and Jagdstaffeln for pursuit. Heinrich Egon transferred to the air service and began the rigorous training to become a pilot, which typically lasted 6 to 8 months and included ground school in aerodynamics, navigation, and gunnery at facilities like the Flugpark in Johannisthal, near Berlin, followed by flight instruction on trainers like the Rumpler BI, progressing to fighters such as the Albatros D-30. Training emphasized aerobatics, formation flying, and combat tactics, with a focus on marksmanship from unstable platforms, and graduates received the pilot's badge after 20 solo flights. By 1918, he had earned his wings and was assigned to Royal Prussian Jagdstaffel 15, Jasta 15, a frontline fighter squadron formed on September 28, 1916, at Bixhow under the Jagdgruppe 7, later part of Jagdgeschwader 2, commanded by Adolf von Tuchek. Jasta 15, equipped with aircraft like the Fokker D-7 by 1918, operated over the Western Front, achieving over 150 aerial victories, while suffering 7 killed in action, 2 in accidents, and 3 wounded, participating in key operations during the Spring Offensive and the defense against Allied air superiority. The squadron's emblem, a black crane, symbolized its aggressive pursuit role, and it flew from bases like Balatra and Mesnil-Bruntel, engaging in patrols to intercept British and French bombers. The life of a fighter pilot was a life of extreme contrasts, moments of calm behind the lines, followed by terrifying minutes of life-or-death combat in the air, with daily routines involving early morning briefings, multiple sorties lasting 1 to 2 hours each, and post-flight debriefs, all amid the stress of mechanical failures and enemy fire. While living conditions behind the lines were often better than those of the infantry, with officers quartered in chateaus or tents equipped with mess halls serving wine and captured luxuries, the psychological toll was immense as pilots faced anti-aircraft fire, Archie, and superior Allied numbers by 1918. Every flight was a gamble with death, as engagements at altitudes of 3,000 to 5,000 meters involved high-speed chases and spins, with risks like engine jams or structural failures in biplanes reaching speeds of 200 kilometers per hour. Flying fragile machines of wood and canvas, German pilots for most of the war lacked parachutes introduced only in mid-1918 due to concerns over encouraging bailouts, meaning a hit to the fuel tank, or controls often resulted in a fiery plunge to the earth, as recounted in memoirs, like Oswald Boelke's tactics manual, that stressed teamwork to mitigate risks. The life expectancy of a new pilot at the front was notoriously short, averaging 17 hours of flight time, or 3 weeks in 1917 during Bloody April, when British losses reached 245 aircraft, reflecting the high turnover in units like Jasta 15, where replacements arrived weekly to fill gaps from combat or exhaustion. Despite the glamour propagated in propaganda films and postcards depicting aces with pour le mérite medals, the reality was a brutal grind of fatigue, cold cockpits, and the constant threat of death. But for men like Heinrich Egon, it was a way to fulfill their sense of duty in a war that had destroyed the romantic ideals of their youth. While we lack Heinrich Egon's personal writings from his time as a pilot, we can glimpse his experiences through the lens of those who served alongside him in the Luftstreitkräfte, where operational records and squadron histories provide insights into the daily realities faced by fighter pilots in the final year of the war. His fellow pilots would have been a similar breed, young, daring, and often hailing from aristocratic or affluent backgrounds. They formed an intense bond, a brotherhood forged in the knowledge that their survival depended on each other. Pilots operated in formations, employing tactics to cover each other's blind spots during patrols that lasted 1 to 2 hours, often multiple times daily. Their days were a cycle of tense anticipation during pre-flight briefings on enemy movements, brief but brutal combat involving high-speed pursuits and evasive maneuvers, and the ever-present shadow of loss. Squadron turnover was high, with replacements arriving weekly to fill vacancies from crashes, wounds, or exhaustion-induced errors. Post-mission debriefs fostered this bond, with shared meals in makeshift messes and discussions of victories, reinforcing a sense of collective achievement amid the isolation of solo duels. Flying demanded constant vigilance not just against the enemy, but against mechanical failures like engine overheating or fabric tears from high G maneuvers, which could prove fatal at combat altitudes where oxygen scarcity and freezing temperatures compounded the risks. His fellow pilots in Jasta 15 would have been a similar breed, young, daring, and often hailing from aristocratic or affluent backgrounds, reflecting the broader composition of German fighter squadrons, where noble officers predominated due to their pre-war equestrian and leadership training, which translated well to the individualistic nature of aerial warfare. The unit's roster included figures like Ulrich Neckel, who later commanded Jasta 19 and earned the Pour le Mérite for 30 victories, illustrating the caliber of personnel, typically in their early 20s, with prior infantry or cavalry experience, and motivated by a blend of patriotism and the allure of aerial chivalry. They formed an intense bond, a brotherhood forged in the knowledge that their survival depended on each other, where mutual reliance was essential for survival. Pilots operated in formations of 4 to 6 aircraft, employing tactics like those outlined by Oswald Boca, such as attacking from the sun or maintaining altitude advantage to cover each other's blind spots during patrols that lasted 1 to 2 hours, often multiple times daily. These young men relied on each other for survival in the unforgiving skies, their days a cycle of tense anticipation during pre-flight briefings on enemy movements, brief but brutal combat involving high-speed pursuits and evasive loops amid anti-aircraft fire and superior Allied numbers by 1918, and the ever-present shadow of loss as squadron turnover was high, with replacements arriving weekly to fill vacancies from crashes, wounds, or exhaustion-induced errors. Post-mission debriefs fostered this bond, with shared meals in makeshift messes, often featuring captured rations, and discussions of victories, which were meticulously verified through ground confirmations to award credits, reinforcing a sense of collective achievement amid the isolation of solo duels. At Donaueschingen, telegrams ruled the day. Pride in a son at the front, mixed with dread that the next knock would end a dynasty's sleep. This position created an agonizing dichotomy, publicly projecting unwavering confidence in Germany's eventual victory through speeches and legislative advocacy for conservative policies that bolstered military funding and suppressed domestic dissent under the Burgfrieden, while privately battling the gnawing fear for his eldest son and heir, who was risking his life daily over the Western Front, where pilot attrition rates hovered around 50% for new arrivals in 1918 amid intensified Allied air campaigns. Every casualty list published in newspapers like the Berliner Tageblatt, every hushed report of a pilot lost in action relayed through military channels or noble networks, must have sent a jolt of dread through the palatial halls of Donaueschingen, the family's principal residence, where staff and relatives monitored telegrams and dispatches with heightened vigilance, aware that the squadron's losses included 7 combat fatalities over the war. For his mother, Princess Irma, born Princess of Schönberg-Hartenstein, the waiting must have been an unbearable torment, a constant tightrope walk between fierce pride in her son's courage, evident in his transfer to the high-risk air service, and the paralyzing fear of receiving the dreaded telegram that announced a soldier's death, a standard military notification that arrived without warning, often delayed by weeks due to frontline chaos. The letters they did receive, carefully censored by military authorities to omit operational details or expressions of doubt that could undermine morale, would have offered only fleeting moments of reassurance amidst the overwhelming uncertainty, typically limited to brief confirmations of health and vague allusions to duty, as pilots were instructed to maintain an optimistic tone to avoid alarming families amid the broader societal strain of rationing and air raids. This period also brings to the forefront the complex and often debated role of the German aristocracy during the First World War, where historical analyses reveal a class deeply embedded in the conflict's front lines rather than detached observers. There's a common misconception that the elites were far removed from the horrors of the trenches, sending common soldiers to their deaths while they remained in relative safety. A narrative perpetuated in post-war literature and socialist critiques that portrayed nobles as war profiteers exploiting the masses. However, for the German nobility, this narrative is largely inaccurate, as evidenced by statistical records showing that approximately 10,000 nobles served in the armed forces, with casualty rates of 20 to 25%, higher than the overall army average of 18%, due to their concentration in officer roles where exposure to danger was greater. A staggering number of aristocratic officers were killed in action, often leading from the very front in infantry assaults or cavalry charges during the war's mobile phases, such as the 1914 advances through Belgium and France, where units like the Garde Cuirassier Regiment suffered disproportionate losses from machine gun fire. Their deeply ingrained code of honor dictated that they be the first into battle, exemplifying bravery and inspiring their men through personal example, rooted in traditions of noblesse oblige and Pflicht, duty, that viewed retreat as dishonor and positioned officers as moral exemplars in a hierarchical military structure. In the initial months of the war, the casualty rates among these officers were devastatingly high, a stark testament to their commitment to their traditional role. With over 1,000 noble deaths recorded in 1914, alone as they led charges at battles like Liege and the Marne, where the emphasis on offensive spirit, Angriffsgeist, led to exposed positions and heavy attrition. From this perspective, Heinrich Egon's decision to become a fighter pilot, a particularly perilous role with life expectancies, as low as 3 weeks for novices in 1917 to 1918, can be seen as an extension of this aristocratic ethos, a desire to serve with distinction and embrace even the greatest risks for his country, mirroring the transfers of other nobles from ground units to aviation to seek active combat amid the stalemate. Yet a more critical perspective must also be considered, drawing from historiographical debates that link the war's origins to the societal structures upheld by the elite, the very culture that fostered such bravery and self-sacrifice, the ingrained militarism, the fervent nationalism, the unquestioned acceptance of aristocratic privilege and duty, was also the same culture that had played a significant role in leading Europe down the path to this catastrophic conflict, as argued by scholars like Fritz Fischer, who highlighted Germany's aggressive war aims and the elite's support for expansionist policies in the pre-1914 period. The German elite, with their close ties to the military and the Kaiser, exemplified by figures like Prince Max Egon II's advocacy for alliance fulfillment and Wilhelm II's bellicose diplomacy, had largely championed the aggressive foreign policy and the relentless arms race that made the outbreak of war almost inevitable, including the naval buildup under Tirpitz and the blank check to Austria in 1914, driven by fears of encirclement and a desire to assert dominance. They often viewed war as a legitimate instrument of statecraft, a necessary, even glorious test of national strength and virility, rooted in a worldview shaped by social Darwinism and the glorification of martial virtues in education and society, which normalized conflict as a means to preserve imperial status against rising powers like Britain and Russia. In this light, while Heinrich Egon's personal courage cannot be denied, as demonstrated by his frontline service in a role with high fatality rates, he was also a participant in a war fueled, at least in part, by the very values and the very class into which he was born. A war that would ultimately shatter their world forever, leading to the collapse of the German Empire, the loss of noble privileges under the Weimar Republic, and the reconfiguration of European society away from aristocratic dominance. This reveals a tragic irony. The same code of honor that made these men brave was part of the political system that led them all to war that claimed over 2 million German lives and reshaped the continent. The year 1918 marked Germany's final desperate gamble in a war that had already drained the nation of its manpower, resources, and resolve, as the High Command under Erich Ludendorff orchestrated the spring offensive to seize a decisive victory before the arrival of overwhelming American reinforcements could tip the scales irrevocably. Launched on March 21, 1918, with Operation Michael, this series of assaults began with an unprecedented artillery barrage of over 6,000 guns, firing more than 1.2 million shells in 5 hours along a 40-mile front near the Somme River, targeting British positions held by the 3rd and 5th Armies under Generals Julian Byng and Hubert Gough. The offensive involved 74 divisions, including elite stormtrooper units trained in infiltration tactics to bypass strong points and exploit weaknesses, achieving initial breakthroughs that advanced up to 40 miles and captured 70,000 prisoners, along with over 1,000 guns by early April. Subsequent phases, such as Operation Georgette in Flanders, starting April 9th, and Operation Blucher York on the Aisne River from May 27th, further strained Allied lines, pushing French forces back toward Paris and inflicting heavy casualties, over 200,000 in the first stage alone, while German losses mounted to similar levels due to supply shortages, fatigue, and the inability to sustain momentum against reinforced defenses. By July, the offensive had faltered entirely, halted by Allied counteroffensives like the Second Battle of the Marne on July 15th to 18th, where fresh American divisions under General John Pershing played a pivotal role in repelling the last German push, marking the beginning of the 100 Days offensive that would drive the Central Powers back. The German army emerged exhausted, with desertions rising, morale plummeting amid influenza outbreaks that killed tens of thousands of soldiers, and material shortages exacerbating the sense of inevitable defeat as the blockade strangled supplies and the home front faced starvation riots. Resources were depleted to critical levels, ammunition stocks low, horses emaciated from lack of fodder, and fuel reserves insufficient for mechanized operations, while the momentum shifted decisively to the Allies, bolstered by 2 million American troops by summer's end, enabling coordinated attacks that reclaimed lost ground and pushed toward the Hindenburg Line. It was amidst this atmosphere of dwindling hope, where German forces grappled with defensive retreats and increasingly fierce fighting against superior numbers and technology, that on July 19, 1918, hereditary Prince Heinrich Egon zu Fürstenberg climbed into the cockpit of his Fokker DVI fighter for what would prove his final mission. Assigned to Jagdstaffel 15, operating over the contested skies near Moronvilliers in the Champagne region of France, a sector scarred by years of attrition, battles like the 1915 offensives and now part of the Allied push following the Marne reversal. His patrol aimed to intercept enemy aircraft supporting ground operations, a routine yet hazardous task in an area where air superiority was hotly contested by French Spads and British SE-5s. But this time, amid the intensifying aerial clashes that saw German losses escalate to over 400 aircraft in July alone due to Allied numerical advantages and improved tactics, he would not return, his plane downed in combat, marking the end of a brief but intense flying career that embodied the high stakes of late war aviation. In the deadly ballet of aerial combat, characterized by high-altitude dogfights where pilots maneuvered at speeds up to 200 kilometers per hour, evading machine gun fire and anti-aircraft shells while contending with mechanical unreliability and oxygen deprivation, his aircraft was struck down by enemy fire, likely during an engagement with Allied fighters patrolling the same sector to protect reconnaissance missions. Heinrich Egon was killed in action, his death confirmed through squadron reports and family notifications, at the age of just 22, adding to the tally of over 5,000 German airmen lost throughout the war, many in the final months when desperation led to riskier sorties against overwhelming odds. This loss exemplified the perilous nature of fighter pilot duty, where survival rates plummeted in 1918 as Allied air forces, swollen by American production, outnumbered the Luftstreitkräfte 3-1 by autumn, forcing German pilots into defensive roles with outdated equipment and fuel shortages that limited patrol durations. The news of his death sent a profound shockwave through his family and the Fürstenberg dynasty, whose centuries-old lineage, tracing back to 1218 and elevated to princely status in 1664, now faced an existential crisis with the extinction of the direct heir, compelling a re-evaluation of succession plans amid the broader noble family's wartime decimations. Their Erbe Prinz, carefully nurtured through elite education in Vienna and Berlin, rigorous military training in cavalry and aviation, and immersion in the aristocratic code of duty that positioned him as the embodiment of future leadership for estates spanning Baden-Württemberg, Bohemia, and beyond, was gone, his potential unfulfilled in the brutal machinery of modern war that had already claimed over 2 million German lives by mid-1918. The ultimate tragedy of his death was its timing. He was killed on July 19th, just 4 months before the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, in a railway car at Compiègne Forest, where German delegates under Matthias Erzberger accepted terms dictating evacuation of occupied territories within 14 days, demobilization of the army, and surrender of vast military assets, including 5,000 guns and 1,700 aircraft. He had endured 4 long years of the most horrific war in human history. From the initial enthusiasm of 1914 through the trench stalemates of Verdun and the Somme, where casualties exceeded 1 million each, to the aerial perils of 1918, navigating constant threats of death from artillery barrages, gas attacks, and dogfights, only to be struck down in its final agonizing moments when peace negotiations were already underway in secret channels, such as those initiated by Prince Max of Baden's government in October. It is a stark reminder of the war's indiscriminate cruelty, snatching away lives even as the prospect of peace loomed large, with over 2,700 soldiers dying on November 11th alone before the 11 a.m. ceasefire, underscoring how the conflict's machinery ground on relentlessly until the very end, indifferent to individual fates or impending resolution. This timing amplified the family's grief, as Heinrich Egon's survival might have allowed him to witness the armistice's implementation, which not only halted fighting but also set the stage for the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, imposing reparations and territorial losses that further eroded noble holdings. But the tragedy for the House of Fürstenberg extended even further, compounding personal loss with the collapse of the societal order that had sustained their status for generations. Just days before the armistice that silenced the guns across the Western Front, ending a war that had mobilized 70 million combatants and caused 20 million deaths, the German Empire itself imploded under the weight of military defeats, naval mutinies at Kiel starting October 29th, and revolutionary uprisings in cities like Berlin and Munich, where workers and soldiers' councils demanded democratic reforms and an end to monarchical rule. Facing widespread unrest, including the spread of Soviets inspired by the Russian Revolution and the collapse of the military high command's authority after Ludendorff's resignation on October 26th, Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate his throne on November 9th, 1918, an announcement made unilaterally by Chancellor Prince Max von Baden in Berlin to preempt further chaos even before Wilhelm's formal consent from his headquarters in Spa, Belgium. He fled into exile in the Netherlands on November 10th, crossing the border at Eisden and settling at Huisdoorn, where he would live until 1941, renouncing claims to the Prussian throne in a document dated November 28th that acknowledged the revolutionary government's legitimacy. The German monarchy, a pillar of European history for over 1,000 years since the Holy Roman Empire's foundations, and unified under the Hohenzollerns in 1871, crumbled in a matter of days, replaced by the nascent Weimar Republic proclaimed on November 9th by Philipp Scheidemann from the Reichstag balcony, establishing a parliamentary democracy amid ongoing street violence and Spartacist revolts. The very world that Prince Heinrich Egon had known, shaped by imperial hierarchies, courtly protocols, and noble privileges, including the Fürstenberg's seats in the Prussian House of Lords and ties to the Kaiser circle, simply ceased to exist as the revolution abolished hereditary titles, legal standing, confiscated estates in newly independent regions like Czechoslovakia, where the family lost Bohemian properties, and redistributed land under socialist pressures. The throne he was born to inherit had been erased by the revolution, as the November events dismantled the autocratic system and introduced universal suffrage, workers' rights, and republican governance that marginalized the aristocracy. Had he somehow survived that final fateful flight over Moronvilliers, he would have returned not as a conquering hero to a triumphant empire celebrating victory parades, but as a prince in a land that no longer recognized or even desired princes, facing economic hyperinflation, loss of family assets under Versailles reparations, totaling 132 billion gold marks, and the social upheaval that saw nobles adapt to democratic norms or emigrate. The foundations of his identity, rooted in duty to the Kaiser, honor in military service and privilege of birth, and his expected future of managing estates, participating in conservative politics, and perpetuating dynastic alliances had vanished, leaving behind a void that no victory could have filled, as the war's end ushered in an era of uncertainty where former elites navigated republican bureaucracy, land reforms, and the rise of extremist movements that would further destabilize Germany in the interwar years. This convergence of personal tragedy and imperial collapse highlighted the profound irony of WWI's conclusion, where individual sacrifices like Heinrich Egon's were rendered moot by the very outcomes they sought to prevent, underscoring the war's role in accelerating the decline of Europe's old order and paving the way for modern democratic and later totalitarian structures. The story of Heinrich Egon zu Fürstenberg is not a grand narrative of a figure who shaped history. Instead, it is a deeply human story, a poignant symbol of an entire world that vanished forever. He was a product of 1,000 years of aristocratic tradition, a life defined by immense privilege and an unwavering sense of duty. And yet all of it, the majestic castles, the ancient titles, the intricate code of honor, was ultimately consumed by the insatiable fires of a single terrible war. His early death leaves behind a particularly poignant what if. What kind of leader would he have become had he survived to guide his family through the turbulent years of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazism? It is a question history can never answer, adding another layer of tragedy to his untimely end. He remains forever frozen in time, the golden prince of a lost world, his potential forever unfulfilled. Ultimately, Heinrich Egon is one of the countless forgotten names of the lost generation, the millions of young men whose bright futures were tragically extinguished in the mud of the Western Front. His personal story is a quiet but powerful reminder that the true cost of war is measured not just in lives lost, but in the immeasurable potential that was buried alongside them. He was a prince from another era who met his end in the brutal nightmare of the 20th century, and his only inheritance became a name etched onto a stone memorial, a silent testament to a world that was gone forever.